Our loving God in heaven, here we are at the end of another week, and we thank you for all your blessings. We thank you for your watch care over us, for your loving kindness, for your truth. And as we come together tonight, we ask for your presence. Bless us as we study things that are relevant to our message, but we also pray for deeper understanding of all those things that have been taught, that we would be more solid on them. Pray for your guidance in what is being said, and we leave ourselves in your care. Thank you, dear God, for this privilege of being part of the end time movement. Help us to take it to heart and mind. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so we are studying atheism at the end of the world. We went to the beginning of the world and we looked at the Tower of Babel. Can anybody tell me the two principles that we took away, the two characteristics of the Tower of Babel that we've taken away so far? We reviewed last week. Ray.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure if these are the ones that were reviewed last week, but was like self-exaltation, self-promotion, something along those lines?
Okay, did you watch last week's, Ray?
I didn't get a chance to yet. So it's taking a step in the dark.
It's all right. So you're half right, Josephine?
Oh, then I'm half right too. The same things I was going to say that Raymond said.
Okay, so self-exaltation, self-promotion, yes, that they are different but similar. And then there's something else.
Self-preservation.
Give us a clue.
Self-preservation.
Yeah.
Self-exaltation, and that includes self-promotion, yes. The horns and the gadar, the hubris, and self-preservation. Whoops, I'm just about to write the wrong one again. Okay, they needed to escape a flood. They needed to escape a global catastrophe that could possibly cause their extinction. And as we looked down the characteristics of the Tower of Babel, we could see that those people ticked all the boxes that we learnt from Daniel chapter 8, and how counterfeit religion closely mimics the true. You always have to have an original to be counterfeited. And so the Tower of Babel was a counterfeit of God's religion, as explained in Daniel chapter 8, that self-exaltation, the need of a deliverer, and we looked at all those things. So one of the things we noted with Daniel chapter 8 is that it goes from the daily to the abomination that makes desolate, and yet it's all the daily. It's paganism, spiritualism. It is the spirit of self-exaltation and self-preservation that goes right through history, self-promotion included there. It's just that it changes according to the dispensation that it's in. So something that is acceptable at one period of Earth's history then becomes unacceptable. We could use the example of human sacrifices. Human sacrifices were the epitome of pagan worship. But that over time that gets taken away, and we see the abomination of desolation has its own form of human sacrifices that is far more civilized and in keeping with its period, its dispensation. Even, if you count 1260 years, even the persecution ends towards the end of those 1260 years because of changes in society, changes in the cultures. And yet it's still there. It's just changing in appearance over time, if that makes sense. So it's the daily all the way through. It's just going to look more acceptable as we go through history. The counterfeit always follows the true, and it can come very close. So we noted how the papacy just legitimized paganism. And it was just a continuation, really, of the daily. Look more refined, more cultivated by wearing Christian garments. So self-promotion, self-exaltation, that's obviously not a good thing. What about self-preservation? Any thoughts about self-preservation? Isn't it innate in us that we don't want to die, or that we want to protect ourselves? Any thoughts about self-preservation? Graham.
So, yes, I think we are inbuilt with self-preservation in one sense, because we have a flight or fight system within us. We have certain things within us that we're made that way. But I think that the self-preservation that we're referring to here is putting oneself above others, almost like a hierarchy in terms of maybe social standing, like a patriarchal system where men are at the top and then everybody else is below.
Okay, so it's a self-preservation that is determined by making sure you get saved above somebody else, perhaps?
Yeah, that was my thought. Putting yourself above others in a very selfish way, not just your own personal life being saved, that we see in a flight or fight response when we get into an emergency situation.
It kind of reminds me of Daniel chapter 8, where the two powers tread down God's host and God's sanctuary. They come on top of them. They have to tread them down in order to make sure that they don't lose anything, that they are on top. It's part of lifting oneself up is treading down somebody else. Ray?
Yeah, my first thought was how their self-preservation was, it started in the denial of God. Like they knew that there'd been a flood, but they denied God. So it was kind of based in that, like, God doesn't exist, but we know there was a flood and we want to make sure it doesn't happen again. So it's very much about what they could do to save themselves, and not about what God could do to save them.
Okay, so thank you. It's something they accomplish on their own without God. Josephine?
Yeah, I was thinking about Babel. they wanted self-preservation. They built the tower. And today we have atheism, and their aim is self-preservation. But in a different way altogether from, it's like in a modernized way from the Tower of Babel. They're not building a tower. They're educating people to what shall I say, to try and preserve resources or what for the future of the population in their minds.
Okay, I guess my question is, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with self-preservation? Is there something innately wrong with that?
Very selfish. It's a small group of people. It's like making distilling the population to a purified group of elite people. I may not be explaining it as well, but
no, that's good. Thank you, Josephine. Molly?
My thought is that, because of the experience that I had with the flood, and they really wanted to exalt themselves to a point where they don't need any help from God, and they wanted to really now do everything in their power to preserve not only the planet but also themselves. It's sort of a rebellion, ideology behind it.
Okay, so you've linked that to rebellion.
Yeah.
Thank you, Molly. Rachel?
I think it can be seen as both. I think it can be that natural, looking after yourself, in that way, but looked at the extreme of self-preservation and maybe in the context of nationalism, thinking to preserve your gender or your race. I think that's when it can become extreme and damaging. Just a thought.
Nice thought. When you said that, it reminded me of being on an airplane. And you've got to take the oxygen mask to yourself before you give it to the child. So when I say, is it something wrong with it? You would say depends.
Yeah, exactly. Depends. Depends how you use it.
Yeah. There's a time when you've got to strengthen yourself in order to help others. So it really does depend in going on from what you said. Thank you, Rachel. And Liam?
The thoughts I had, that there must be, it might be a little bit like freedom, where there's a good and there's a bad. So a certain amount of freedom is fine unless it's not governed by something else. So a certain amount of self-preservation is fine so long as it's governed by something else. And the other thing that I thought of was comparing and contrasting with the Bible. It says, greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friend. So, God laid down his life. So basically, it depends on the principle that's ruling that self-preservation. It's not that it has to be wrong of itself, but if it's ruling, then that's a problem.
Yeah, good. That kind of ties in with what Rachel and with Molly saying rebellion. Like if your rebellion, anti-God is behind your sentiment, then there's something wrong with that. But when what you've said, Lynn, reminds me of Gethsemane. So that Jesus struggled with the temptation to preserve himself. And that was a time when he had to lay down his life for his people. But the previous Passover, he did preserve himself. He didn't go to Jerusalem, he stayed in Galilee. If he had gone to Jerusalem, he would have died a year earlier. So that was self-preservation, but it was for the greater good. It wasn't a self-preservation based on himself. It was for the good of the movement. So yes, motives, timing, etc. all come into play there. Thank you, Lynn. Very good. Just as an exercise, these are antonyms. So an antonym is what? It's a word that is opposite. So what is the opposite of self-preservation? The opposite of it is self-denial, selflessness, unselfishness, altruism, benevolence, philanthropy, generosity, charity, liberality, and the list goes on. So even in just looking at what the dictionary says is the opposite of self-preservation, we get an insight into what it is. This is what it is not. But I like the idea that it will depend on what you're trying to preserve. Are you trying to preserve self? If you are trying to preserve self, then you are selfish. It's what you're trying to preserve. You may need to take that oxygen mask to yourself first so that you can preserve the child sitting next to you. So it's not just about self. Okay, thank you for that. So, Tower Babel, what were they trying to preserve themselves from? A god, Molly said, and the existential risk of another flood. So they built a tower to escape from this existential risk. And as we come down to the end of the world, we see that there are many towers being built to escape existential risks. What are the things that people are putting in place to save themselves at the end of the world? So first of all, we went through and listed a lot of existential risks. And I just want to talk about that for a minute, in that when we talked about these existential risks, I'm not talking about the type of things that you would find in a tabloid newspaper, in some sort of sensational magazine. These are what scientists, engineers, philosophers, politicians seriously consider are risks to humanity. So much so that much money and time is being funneled in to understand these existential risks and what they can do to prevent them. So I'll just give you so this is called the Centre for the Study of Existential Risks, that's run out of Cambridge. We are dedicated to the study and mitigation of risks that could lead to human extinction or civilization collapse. And even if we go down and meet our team, if we were to go to the team, you'll see many learned people on this team. We bring together some of the best minds from academia, technology, and policy to collaborate on our shared challenges. So notice that threefold union: academia, technology, policy, politics. The co-founders, notice this, there's Jan Tallinn, billionaire. Skype, made his money from Skype. And all these philosophers, research assistants, etc. I'll just go down to the bottom. Alumni. And we have the no, we don't want the management board. That's very good. Scientific Advisory Board. Nick Bostrom is one that we will be looking at. Who else is there? Here we go, Peter Singer, another one we will be looking at. This one is the one from Oxford. Whoop, up there. And this is the Future of Humanity Institute. Future of Humanity Institute joins DeepMind, OpenAI, Facebook, Amazon, and others in the partnership on AI. FHI is a multidisciplinary research institute at the University of Oxford. Academics at FHI bring the tools of mathematics, philosophy, and social scientists to bear on big picture questions about humanity and its prospects. The institute is led by founding director, Professor Nick Bostrom. Again, that name will come up a few times. And I should have looked up this. This is Oxford and Cambridge we've looked at, but there's one in America, and I meant to bring that up and forgot. So that'll do for now. So we're not looking at tabloid fears. We're looking at what looks very, very real to a lot of learned people. So one of the towers that they've built to deal with this is called long-termism. So we looked at long-termism. I'll just write existential risks. And long-termism is one of the, it's not too good, is it? One of the philosophies that we've been looking at. Long-termism is the philosophical idea that the long-term future of humanity is way more important than the present, and that those alive today should make sacrifices for the good of all the generations to come. The key argument of long-termists is that our planet will remain habitable for a few billion years, which means that most people who'll ever be alive are yet to be born. What we did is we looked at some graphs to show some of their predictions of how many people would, in their probability and their calculations, would be alive in the future, given that the life of a mammal is around, average 100,000 years, and we've only had around 300,000 years. We should have a good length of time left. The difference between us and other animals is that we have technology we've developed. We should be able to far exceed that time limit of an ordinary mammal. So a conservative estimate is to assume that our planet will be populated by at least 1 billion people for at least 1 billion years. So that's 1 billion human life years. With today's typical lifespan of 100 years, that'd be about 10 to the 16 human lives. So I'll just draw this backwards. 1, 2, 3, 6. 13, 14, 15, 16. That's about how many people would about how many people there could be alive in the future, which far outweighs the amount of people that have lived in the past and are living at the present. So that's the potential, unless there's an existential risk. If we go extinct, so the first and foremost priority of long-termists is to minimize existential risks. This includes events that could lead to human extinction, like And we listed them all: asteroids, nuclear war, rogue artificial intelligence. And what long-termists believe is that right now we're at a pivotal point in Earth's history. We're on a hinge, that if we don't step in and do something now, that if we don't become extinct, we would certainly put humanity way back in the dark ages, and we would possibly never reach our full potential and go extinct far earlier. So we are in a pivotal moment in human history. One person wrote, "We live during the hinge of history. The world's long-run fate depends in part on the choices we make in our lifetimes. Society has not yet settled down into a stable state, and we are able to influence which stable state we end up. So it's up to us." So there are all these think tanks, these organizations, and they are influencing politics. They are getting a lot of money. Billionaires are funding them to come up with these answers to existential risks, so that we can do a lot of good by saving the greatest amount of people that haven't been born yet. So we're talking about atheists. With atheists, it is just like we're talking about self-preservation. Are atheists moral? Can an atheist be moral? What does it mean to be moral? And can atheists be moral? Any thoughts? What is it to be moral? A moral person? Where do we get our morality from? Ray?
You good citizen.
Sorry. So like we get our morality from prophecy. But yeah, I guess I would define morality overall as like the values and principles that you choose to live by.
Okay. Can you name them?
So for us, like the 10 Commandments obviously forms a like really core part of our morals.
Yes.
Which you can narrow further down to the 2.
Yes. So morality is just, it's knowing what's right or wrong. So the 10 Commandments tell us what's right or wrong. You can do this, you can't do that. Prophecy helps us to put those 10 Commandments in their right time. So this is where we learn about policy and principle. So we understand the 10 Commandments today a little different than what Moses did and what Paul did. But the principle is the same, the policy changes. So that's where prophecy helps us. Lynn?
I was kind of thinking that your first comment about, can atheists be moral? And I was thinking in terms of a lot of people go by the, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which is the golden rule, even though that kind of comes from the Bible anyway. A lot of people live by that kind of a rule or claim to. And so I guess basically anyone can be moral, but not everybody can be righteous. And there's a difference between being moral and righteous.
So when they do unto others as they'd like done unto them,
Oh,
that we
yes.
would say they're keeping the 10 Commandments even though they don't recognise it.
To a point, that's true. The other thing I was going to say was the fact that if you've got all these atheists who are trying to say, well, we should sacrifice ourselves for the greater good of those who are coming because there's so many more coming, there's an altruistic factor to that. So you could say there's an unselfishness about that potentially. So, albeit on the wrong foundation, that in itself does have a sense of altruism about it. So it's an interesting thing.
Yes. So it has the potential, depending on what they're sacrificing. Are they sacrificing themselves? What exactly are they sacrificing for the greater good?
So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it, like I say, it has an altruistic sound to it, or an altruistic tone to it, let's say. But really, you know, if you dig deeper, there may be other factors involved. And it may even come down to the individual, because maybe some people do have very altruistic motives, whereas others may have far from altruistic motives. They might have, you know, benefiting themselves motives somehow. So yeah, anyway, it's just an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, thank you, Ling. It reminds me of the Tower of Babel, that, you know, what might have started out as thinking they were going to benefit everybody eventually crumbled. As you said, they're looking to do what is right, but remember, they didn't want to follow the law. They wanted to reject God's law. So they're looking to do what is right without the law. And that only, I guess by their fruits you know them. We see how that ended. Molly?
I thought that morals, you know, when sin happened, then it's sort of inbuilt into everyone. And but I mean, just to live it out, it depends on the motives and the intention everyone's got. You know, sometimes a lot of people, they do it only because, in a very hypocritical way, you know, they do it like the Pharisees. They do good works only because someone is there to look at it. But, you know, when it comes to the Good Samaritan story, when there was no one seeing, they very quickly on the side and go away. So really, morals, it comes down to the intention and the motive behind. But I believe that everyone knows what's good and what's bad.
Okay, that's a good point. When you compare the Pharisees to the Samaritan, which one knew what to do, what was right? And how did they know that? Because the Pharisees knew the law, and yet they didn't do what was right. So how that gets it's just interesting what the mind will do in order to justify itself. When you think of the Pharisees, they were preserving themselves, preserving their time, preserving their reputation, and at the expense of somebody else. And we saw true altruism in the Good Samaritan.
Yeah.
Thank you, Molly. So let me share something with you. This is from Science News. They did a survey. Atheists and believers both have moral compasses. So like you said, Molly, they know what is right and wrong, but there are key differences. Belief in God associated with stronger endorsement of moral values that promote group cohesion. Okay, so that's the difference. We'll just read the beginning, then we'll read the end. A new study suggests that while atheists and the theists share moral values related to protecting vulnerable individuals, atheists are less likely to endorse values that promote group cohesion and more inclined to judge the morality of actions based on their consequences. Thomas Stahl of the University of Illinois at Chicago presents these findings in this journal. This is a 2021 journal, and we'll just go down to his conclusions here. Stahl adds, the most general take-home message from these studies is that people who do not believe in God do have a moral compass. In fact, they share many of the same moral concerns that religious believers have, such as concerns about fairness and about protecting vulnerable individuals from harm. However, disbelievers are less inclined than believers to endorse moral values that serve group cohesion, such as having respect for authorities, in-group loyalty, and sanctity. Sanctity is the understanding that something is very important and valuable. Think of it as holy. We talk about the sanctity of life, that it is vital, valuable, and holy. It is possible that the negative stereotype of atheists as immoral may stem in part from the fact that they are less inclined than religious people to view respect for authority, in-group loyalty, and sanctity as relevant for morality, and they are more likely to make moral judgments about harm on a consequentialist case-by-case basis. Okay, so let's have a think about this. Does anything come to mind when it says they are where is it? They are less inclined to than believers to endorse moral values that serve group cohesion. If we go back to where we start from, Genesis 11. What ultimately happened to that tower? When something is cohesive, what does that mean? Stop. Rachel.
Sorry, it's me, Chris.
Chris.
Yeah, cohesion has to do with sticking together, but at the conclusion of Babel is a separation.
Yeah, it all fell apart, didn't it? In the end, they couldn't keep it together. They had a common purpose, but there was nothing really to keep them together. And that's one of the key differences between atheists and theists, religious people, is there's something in their morality that gathers them that they don't fall apart. Did you want to add anything more to that, Chris?
I think my take on, say, atheistic morality is more egocentric than exocentric. It's anything's okay as long as you don't harm somebody else. Whereas, yeah, biblical morality is more concerned about others more than yourself.
So you can really see self-preservation there. It's the looking after self. We don't want to look after the group. This movement on the plane of I want to say Dura, it's not on the wherever the Babel is, I can't remember.
China.
Oh, say it again.
Plane of China.
Thank you. Yes, so Ray, did you want to add something to that?
No, I couldn't have said it better than.
Josephine? Is that what you were going to say, Josephine?
Oh,
Molly?
sorry.
Oh. Okay, Josephine?
Yeah.
Sorry, I think I've forgotten what I was going to say. Maybe I'll remember it sometime
that's
later.
okay. Molly?
Yeah, I thought that they had self-preservation until God got involved. When he start confounding their language, they sort of exploded and they didn't listen to authorities, and everybody was on their own.
They could work together for a while,
Yep.
but yeah, there was nothing lasting. Thank you. Okay, so we go back to this. Let's pick up on. It says they are more likely to make moral judgments about harm on a consequentialist case-by-case basis. So what is the basis of their morality? And there is a philosophy called consequentialism. And one of the consequentialism is kind of an umbrella, but the one that we want to particularly look at today, which is a consequentialist philosophy, is called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, because this is the philosophy that is behind long-termism. Utilitarianism. So what does that mean? What does it mean to have utility? If something has utility, you can see the word utility in it. Graham.
Is it useful?
Yeah, useful. It's, think of a ute. What is a ute? It is a vehicle that is able to, it has a variety of uses. So, you know, in the Northern Hemisphere, Santa Claus has reindeer and a sleigh. In the Southern Hemisphere, he has 6 white boomers and a rusty Holden ute. You know, utes here are the quintessential vehicle for serving any purpose. So when you have a utility, you have purpose, you have it is the state of being useful, profitable, or beneficial. So if you think of utilities like gas, water, electricity, communication, they're essential services and goods that serve great purpose and need. They're deemed essential. So a utility is functional rather than attractive. It's able to perform several functions, which is the definition of a ute. So utilitarianism. What's utilitarianism? Utilitarianism is generally held to be the view that the morally right action is the action that produces the most good. There are many ways to spell out this general claim. One thing to note is that the theory is a form of consequentialism. So it's what's consequential, what creates a consequence. Is that consequence good or is the consequence harmful? The right action is understood entirely in terms of consequences produced. So when it says that atheists will look at the consequences, that is what will determine what is right and wrong. What will give the right amount of good? So utilitarianism was a product of the 18th century. Two philosophers, Bentham and Mills, developed this in, I guess, in the Enlightenment time, this philosophy of utilitarianism. But we want to look at the modern day prophet of utilitarianism. And we're going to come down to the 1970s. I'll just write this. I'm going to write 1971. Let me give you a further definition before we go on. Utilitarianism is an ethical theory that determines right from wrong by focusing on outcomes. It holds that the most ethical choice is the one that will produce the greatest good for the greatest number. However, we cannot predict the future, so it's difficult to know with certainty whether the consequences of our actions will be good or bad, and that's one of the limitations of utilitarianism. So there are different types of utilitarianism. They tended to arise to try and fill up the holes of the one that went before. So there's act utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism, preference utilitarianism, and each one came along to try and fix what was wrong with the one that was previous, because you can get into a real muddle with utilitarianism. So if you think about, they do these thought experiments. You're on a railroad track and the tracks split, and on one side you've got one person that's tied to a track. On the other side, you've got 5 people tied to a track. The train's coming and you're at the switch. Which way are you going to let that train go? And there's all different varying stories on this same theme. Do you let the train kill the one person to save the 5? And a consequentialist, a utilitarian, would say, yes, we do the greatest good, and the greatest good is to save the 5. But that's not always practical, because what if that one person has the cure for cancer and you've just saved 12 drug lords? It's not practical. They can't tell the future, so you really don't know what the consequences, long-term consequences, are going to be. So they kind of jiggle around in this to try and figure out how to determine what is right or wrong. It's so much easier being a Christian. And even there, I mean, it's not just the law, it is prophecy as well. We have been continually learning what is right and wrong, because we thought we understood what was right, and then, yeah, anyway, you know how that story goes. So this is utilitarianism. If we want to get to the root of where long-termism has come from, starts back in the 17th century, 18th century. But, oh well, starts back. Epicurus was was a consequentialist, and he was a Greek philosopher. But I want to take you back to 1971. Introduce you to a man called Peter Singer. Peter Singer is an Australian. He studied at Monash, and he studied law, history and philosophy, and then he decided he would major in philosophy, and he got his degree at Monash, and he got a scholarship to Oxford. And he went to Oxford and he got his degree of philosophy in Oxford. You get a degree of philosophy, there's only a few universities in the world that you get that. It is a very, very prestigious degree when you get your degree of philosophy. So he got a degree in philosophy at Oxford. So when I say 1971, what immediately comes to mind? What history are we talking about? Graham?
Second wave feminism.
Yeah, second wave feminism. So second wave feminism's been around for a few years. And if you remember last week, Brendan was talking about how it got marginalised. And there are many reasons it got marginalised in this history. And this is one of them. So what Peter Singer, unknown to him, he is going to start what was known as a moral revolution. He's going to put out a paper. It's called Famine, Affluence and Morality. Famine, affluence and morality. And it's going to have a profound influence on students and on these educational establishments for decades. Let me... Nope, where is it? So I'll bring it up. He wrote it in 1971. It got printed in 1972. Now just read the very beginning of it. He says, as I write this in November 1971, people are dying in East Bengal from lack of food, shelter and medical care. The suffering and death that are occurring there now are not inevitable, not unavoidable in any fatalistic sense of the term. Constant poverty, a cyclone and a civil war have turned at least 9 million people into destitute refugees. Nevertheless, it is not beyond the capacity of the richer nations to give enough assistance to reduce any further suffering to a very small proportion. The decisions and actions of human beings can prevent this kind of suffering. Unfortunately, human beings have not made the necessary decisions. At the individual level, people have, with very few exceptions, not responded to the situation in any significant way. Generally speaking, people have not given large sums to relief funds. They have not written to their parliamentary representatives demanding increased government assistance. They have not demonstrated in the streets, held symbolic fasts, or done anything else directed toward providing the refugees with the means to satisfy their essential needs. And then he'll go on to explain how little the government has done. The British government had put some pounds into it, but not near enough. So when we're talking about East Bengal, Bengal was a territory between India. Well, it ended up being divided. So East Bengal was a province of Pakistan, West Bengal, India took, and then in 1971, East Bengal got, what do you call it when you,
Independent.
anyway, it became Bangladesh. What's the word? Independent. They became independent, and that's Bangladesh. So there's a lot going on, like he said, cyclone, civil war, it's a mess. Millions are dying, and the government isn't doing anything. And so what he did is he wrote this essay, and in this essay, he argues that people were morally obligated to maximize their impact through charity and focus on causes that offered the greatest quality of life improvements, such as those aimed at reducing poverty and mortality in the global south. So what he did is he told a story, and this story has got repeated over and over again. You're walking along a path in a park, and there's a pond, and there's a child that is drowning in the pond. Do you go into the pond even though you might ruin your shoes, even though you might dirty your clothes? You don't think twice, you go and you save the child. But what if that child isn't in that pond right there? What if that child is thousands of miles away on the other side of the world? Do you have any less obligation in helping that child, even though there's a distance? Distance doesn't make a difference. So this is what he's saying here. Distance shouldn't affect our charitable help. This is going to develop, I think you can see that when we come down to long-termism, it's going to be distance of time, not distance in kilometers or miles. So this is going to develop from a time factor, a distance factor into time. So what if the child was not directly in front of you? What if instead of drowning, the child was in mortal danger due to lack of food, water, or medical treatment? And what if instead of jumping into the water, the only way you can save the child's life is to donate to charity? So, and he says the uncontroversial appearance of the principle just stated is deceptive. If it were acted upon, even in its qualified form, our lives, our society, and our world would be fundamentally changed. For the principle takes, firstly, no account of proximity or distance. It makes no moral difference whether the person I can help is a neighbour's child 10 yards from me or a Bengali whose name I shall never know 10,000 miles away. Secondly, the principle makes no distinction between cases in which I am the only person who could possibly do anything and cases in which I am just one among millions in the same position. So if you were standing on the edge of the pond and there were other people with you and they weren't jumping in, then you could say, oh, well, it's okay that I don't jump in because they're not jumping in. Says, no, it doesn't work like that either. That's not moral either. You have that moral obligation. So this paper is going to, in 1971, it goes viral, whatever viral looks like in 1971, and it's going to affect a lot of these Oxford philosophers at first, and then it travels around the world. So just before we're going to continue this timeline next week, but I'd like to talk to you a bit more about Peter Singer. He's also known, there's another revolution that is going to happen because of his writings in this time period that is also going to marginalize second wave feminism. He writes in 1975, he's going to write a book called Animal Liberation. He's at Oxford, he goes and gets his lunch, he's with a friend. The friend finds out that there's minced meat in the spaghetti bolognese, so he decides to have a salad. And then Singer asks him, why aren't you having the spaghetti bolognese? And he gets a lesson in factory farming and the terrible abuse of animals, and he looks into it and goes home to his wife and says, I don't think we can morally eat meat anymore. And he writes this paper called Animal Liberation. This paper is going to go on to inspire, in 1979, the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. PETA. They all refer to Peter Singer's work as the foundation of the animal liberation movement. So we'll just share this and have a little chat. Okay, so this is from the PETA website. So this is actually 2015 because it is the 40th anniversary of animal liberation. And so they have this write-up on Peter Singer's book and how it started PETA. So let's read a little bit from Peter Singer's work. Animal liberation may sound more like a parody. You've got to think it's 1971. This is a new term in 75, new term back then. We're used to it, but this is very new. Animal liberation may sound more like a parody of other liberation movements than a serious objective. The idea of the rights of animals actually was once used to parody the case for women's rights. When Mary Wollstonecraft published her Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792, her views were widely regarded as absurd, and before long, an anonymous publication appeared entitled A Vindication of the Rights of Brutes. The author of this satirical work, now known to have been Thomas Taylor, a distinguished Cambridge philosopher, tried to refute Mary Wollstonecraft's arguments by showing that they could be carried one stage further. If the argument for equality was sound when applied to women, why should it not be applied to dogs, cats, horses? So this is Peter Singer talking. When we say that all human beings, whatever their race, creed, or sex, are equal, what is it that we are asserting? Like it or not, we must face the fact that humans come in different shapes and sizes. They come with different moral capacities, different intellectual abilities, different amounts of benevolent feeling and sensitivity to the needs of others, different abilities to communicate effectively, and different capacities to experience pleasure and pain. In short, if the demand for equality were based on the actual equality of all human beings, we would have to stop demanding equality. The existence of individual variations that cut across the lines of race or sex, however, provides us with no defense at all against a more sophisticated opponent of equality. One who proposes that, say, the interests of all those with IQ scores below 100 be given less consideration than the interests of those with ratings over 100. Perhaps those scoring below the mark would, in this society, be made the slaves of those scoring higher. Would a hierarchical society of this sort really be so much better than one based on the race or sex? I think not. But if we tie the moral principle of equality to the factual equality of the different races or sexes, taken as a whole, our opposition to racism and sexism does not provide us with any basis for objecting to this kind of inegalitarianism or inequality. One more paragraph. Fortunately, there is no need to pin the case for equality to one particular outcome of a scientific investigation. There is no logically compelling reason for assuming that a factual difference in ability between two people justifies any difference in the amount of consideration we give to their needs and interests. The principle of the equality of human beings is not a description of an alleged actual equality among humans. It is a prescription of how we should treat human beings. So what he is going to go on to say, so have a think about that. What he is going to go on to say is racism, we discriminate people on the basis of different races. Sexism, we discriminate people on the basis of different sex. But he also says there is speciesism. See, we're atheists. We're all animals. We're all of the same species. And we shouldn't discriminate against another species. So he is going to put race, sex, species in the same considered the same. So if we go back to our document, the principle of equality of human beings is not a description of an alleged actual equality among humans. It is a prescription of how we should treat human beings. So does anybody catch what he's been saying in these 3 paragraphs? Somebody like to sum it up and put it in their own words. What's he comparing? Graham.
Is he saying equal but separate? His words are very difficult for me to understand. I don't have the IQ to be able to get around that.
Oh, qualifications. Don't qualify your statements. Yes, you do. What we're looking at is some of the dumbest smart people in the world. Shouldn't call them dumb, but just because they've got degrees doesn't mean that they understand. Any other thoughts? So what did you say, Graham? Could you repeat that?
I was wondering if it was saying equal but separate. So not really.
I think what he's saying is they're not equal. We just got to treat each other as if we were equal. When we say that all human beings, whatever their race, creed, or sex, are equal, what is it that we are asserting? He says, like it or not, we're not equal. We all come in different sizes. We all got different capabilities. We're all got different intellects, different emotions. We are not equal. But we treat each other as if we are we have to treat each other as if we are equal. The principle of equality of human beings is not a description of an alleged actual equality. It's not actual. It is a prescription of how we should treat human beings. So we treat each other as if we are equal. Now, who have I? Brody.
It's amazing to me that his conclusion seems to be that if you were going to say that the genders are equal, then you might as well say that animals and humans are equal. It seems to sum up his opinion on the differences between the genders.
And he is going to say that we are equal with animals. This is animal liberation. This is the philosophy behind the organizations such as PETA and others. Speciesism is a form of discrimination of one species to another species. They will use the example of we say gorillas and oysters are both animals, and we put ourselves on top of them both. We control both of them. Yet we're more aligned with gorillas than we are with an oyster. Why would we lump gorillas and oysters together? They're not equal, but we should treat them like they are. So he didn't invent this term, but what he did was there was another philosopher who actually mentioned this term. But what Peter Singer did was he popularized it. So he wrote this paper, Animal Liberation. He wrote about speciesism, and he claimed that it is analogous. It is the same as racism and sexism and other forms of irrational discrimination and prejudice. So behind utilitarianism is the understanding that we really aren't equal. We just need to be nice to each other. We should treat each other as if we are, even though we're not really. Molly?
My understanding is that he said that we're not equal, but through our action, it affects everyone's equally, like even the same with the animals. So he sort of make us equal in the sense that with animals, in the sense that by the action and choice of one person is affect a different person. It's like how the animals being affected by an action of another animal. But equally, we're not the same. We're not equal with it, but throughout the choice that we make and the action that we do, we are equally treated each other because it's affected other people in the same way. Okay,
so if we were to, if we would reject his reasoning, at the same time, how do we treat animals as Christians? Do we treat them as our equal?
No.
No. So our relationship is that they are God's creation, therefore we are stewards.
Yeah.
So a utilitarian approach is you have to do the greatest good for the animal kingdom as well as for human beings. And that sounds really good, but we will see that it's based on a wrong foundation of what equality is. It's based on speciesism. So we still believe in looking after animals, but we don't put animals before human beings. We understand where they are in God's creation. But if you're an atheist, what's the difference between a human being and an animal? We are animals. So, it would make sense. So there were people that stood up against speciesism because they read his paper and said, you're comparing apples and oranges here. It's not... basically it's wrong methodology, but it's wrong methodology based on an understanding that keeps God out of the equation. So we've looked at so Ray, have you got something to add?
Sorry, go Molly.
Yeah, I just wanted to add because God says that we have to have dominions over all the beasts.
And that's discrimination.
No, so, we are not different. We're supposed to look after them. We're supposed to.
Yes. So when I said it's discrimination, I'm talking like an atheist. like somebody
Yeah.
that is against speciesism.
Yeah.
Yes, to have dominion over something, that means to come up over that. So I just want to keep this in mind, because this is all happening. This is all distracting. This is all marginalizing second wave feminism. And these thoughts are going to continue into our history. Ray, you had something to add?
I just had a question. Where does this fit with, like, remember reviewing the Vespers I did on Wednesday night on the agenda from Darwin to Dawkins? I was talking about how, like, social Darwinists didn't agree with welfare programs and things like that, and eugenics and things. Early ones were in favor of eugenics because they saw it as speeding up the process of evolution and natural selection. So what sort of take does do people with that philosophy have on speciesism? Is that part of why they're against it?
So really, this is just, it was referred to as a moral revolution. So they, Peter Singer is going to take utilitarian philosophy and apply it to charitable work, to altruism. So how are we going to treat people in need? Also, how are we going to treat animals? We've looked at this because what he's done with speciesism is compared it to racism and sexism. So you can understand why they might be promoting a gender equality, but behind all that, they don't actually believe that we are equal. We just need to be nice to each other. We should treat each other as if we're equal. So we should treat animals like we're equal. That means we shouldn't subject them to pain that we wouldn't be prepared to take. So a lot of good came out of this, as far as factory farmings and well, some bad things happened because they were quite radical activists, but some of them were blowing up places, and the activism was quite, it was terrorism more than activism. So, we're looking at the philosophy. So yes, it's Darwinism, because we've all evolved from common ancestor. It's just some of us have evolved more than others, and we are not to discriminate on those that haven't, because we're all equal. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, Ray.
Yeah, I think so. That's where we get people like Sea Shepherd and things.
Yeah. And you will find that the atheism there is causes just as much trouble. When we think of what it was like when we studied New Atheism and the Trinity and the Four Horsemen, all the problems that existed there as far as their understanding of feminism, you're going to find in these movements as well. Even though they are altruistic in their mind, they're using utilitarianism philosophy, and it gets them into knots, which we'll see as we go forward. But so if we could just sum up, what he has begun to say is that morally, we are obligated for the people that are distance from them as much as we're obligated for those that are near. And this is what long-termists are going to use eventually too, as it evolves. So we might have to stop it there for time. Josephine, if you could keep your question for next week, we'll review and keep going, leading up to, we're working on the history of where the roots of long-termism began. So on that note, Brodie, would you close in prayer for us this evening?
Dear God in heaven, thank you, Lord, for this opportunity to consider and study the world around us, Lord, with the perspective that you've given us through your messages. And I ask, Lord, that you would prepare us, give us a firm foundation for our feet so that we know what position to take on these issues as they are increasingly before us. Lord, I pray that as we enter this Sabbath, that you would that you would be with each one of your people, that we would be blessed, that and strengthen each other. I thank you for all you have done for us this week, and we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.